The rain arrives at 3 in the morning, just as it always does in places where people come to die. It taps against the wide window of the palliative care ward with the persistence of a memory you can't shake, each drop catching the fluorescent light from the hallway and sliding down the glass like tears that belong to no one and everyone at once. I watch it from my bed, propped up on pillows that smell faintly of industrial detergent and the kind of hope that comes in small, measured doses. My name is Silas Monroe, and I'm 40 years old, though the mirror in the bathroom down the hall suggests otherwise. The man looking back at me these days is someone I barely recognize, skin pale as parchment, cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, eyes that have seen too much of the inside of this place. Stage for lymphoma. The doctor said 6 months ago. Their voice is clinical and careful, as if the words themselves might shatter if spoken too loudly. 6 months. That felt like a lifetime then. Now it feels like a breath held too long. The machines around my bed hum their mechanical lullabies, indifferent to the weight of what they're measuring. Heart rate, blood pressure, the steady decline of a body that has decided it's tired of fighting. I've grown accustomed to their sounds, the way you grow accustomed to living near train tracks or a busy highway. They fade into the background until they become part of you, a soundtrack to the slow dissolution of everything you thought you knew about yourself. But tonight, there's another sound competing with the rain and the machines. The soft rustle of pages turning. A voice, low and unsteady, reading words that seem to float in the space between us like smoke from a dying fire. The voice belongs to Victor Clay, and that fact alone is enough to make me question whether the morphine has finally gotten the better of my grip on reality. He sits in the visitor's chair beside my bed, a worn paperback in his hands, something I never would have chosen, never would have enjoyed. A thriller, maybe, or one of those dense literary novels that critics love and normal people abandon after 50 pages. I can't see the cover from this angle, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that he's here, has been here every day for weeks now, reading to me with the dedication of a monk reciting prayers. Victor Clay. The name still tastes bitter in my mouth, even after all these years. Even now, when bitterness seems like such a waste of the little energy I have left. He's older, of course. We both are. But the years have been kinder to him than they have to me. His hair has gone silver at the temples. His face has earned lines that speak of laughter and worry in equal measure. And his hands, holding that book with such careful attention, are steadier than they have any right to be. Those hands. I remember them from college 20 years ago when they belonged to a different person entirely. Or maybe not different. Maybe just hidden, buried under layers of fear and anger and the particular cruelty that young men inflict on each other when they don't know how to name what they're feeling. Those hands threw a football with precision, wrote essays that made professors pause and nod, and once, during our senior capstone project, crumpled up a piece of my sheet music and tossed it in the trash, while looking me directly in the eye. "You're pathetic," he had said that day. His voice had been loud enough for the other students to hear, calculated in its brutality. "You think anyone cares about your little songs? Nobody wants to hear that garbage." It had been the final blow in a campaign of small torments that had defined our senior year, a systematic effort to make me invisible, irrelevant, less than human. I had picked the crumpled paper out of the trash later when the room was empty and smoothed it out with shaking hands. The notes were still readable, but something in me had been damaged beyond repair. And now here he is, reading to me in the middle of the night, his voice catching sometimes on words that shouldn't be difficult, as if his throat is remembering how to be gentle. I watch him through half-lidded eyes, too tired to hate him the way I once did, too confused to understand why he's here at all. The morphine makes everything feel distant and strange. But this feels like the strangest thing of all. The book is about a detective, I think, chasing shadows through a city that never sleeps. The words wash over me like water, meaningless and soothing at the same time. But it's not the story that holds my attention. It's the way Victor's voice softens on certain phrases, the way he pauses between chapters, as if giving me time to process what I've heard, the way he glances at me every few minutes to make sure I'm still breathing. Why? The question has been burning in my chest for weeks now, but I've been too proud, or too scared to ask it. Why is he here? Why does he come every day with coffee that's too strong and magazines I'll never read? Why does he argue with the insurance people on my behalf, his voice rising to that same dangerous pitch I remember from college? Except now, it's directed at bureaucrats instead of me. Why does he sleep in that chair some nights, his head tilted at an angle that must leave his neck aching, just so I won't wake up alone? The rain grows heavier, drumming against the window with increased urgency. Somewhere down the hall, a machine starts beeping in alarm, and I hear the quick footsteps of nurses responding to whatever crisis has announced itself. This place is full of small emergencies, moments when bodies decide they've had enough and simply stop cooperating. I've seen it happen to others, the sudden rush of activity, the hushed conversations, the empty beds that appear the next morning, sheets already changed and waiting for the next person who needs a place to let go. But tonight, my machines are quiet, cooperative. Tonight, there's just the rain in Victor's voice and the weight of 20 years of silence pressing down on both of us like a blanket we can't quite shake off. He finishes a chapter and sets the book down on the narrow table beside my bed, next to the water pitcher and the vase of flowers someone sent weeks ago. The flowers are dying now, their petals brown at the edges, but no one has had the heart to throw them away. They're a reminder that this is temporary, all of it, the room, the machines, the strange peace that has settled between us despite everything that came before. I find my voice, though it comes out as barely more than a whisper. You hated me. The words hang in the air between us. Not quite an accusation, not quite a question. They're simply a fact, stated as plainly as the rain against the window or the hum of the machines keeping track of my slow decline. Victor doesn't look up from the book, but I see his shoulders tense, see his hands tighten slightly on the worn paperback cover. For a moment, I think he might pretend he didn't hear me, might go back to reading as if I hadn't spoken at all. It would be easier that way for both of us. We could maintain this strange truce we've fallen into, this careful dance around the truth that sits between us like a landmine waiting to explode. But then he speaks, his voice quiet but clear, and I realize that maybe the morphine isn't making me imagine things after all. Maybe this is real, this moment, this conversation we should have had 20 years ago. Yeah, he says, still not looking at me. I did. The admission hangs there, honest and brutal in its simplicity. No excuses, no explanations, no attempt to soften the edges of what we both know to be true. He hated me. I knew it then, and I know it now. And somehow his honesty makes it easier to bear than any lie would have been. A pause follows, long enough for me to count the steady beeps of the heart monitor, long enough for the rain to shift patterns against the window. Then Victor speaks again, and this time there's something different in his voice, something that sounds almost like a promise. But I'm not leaving. For words. That's all. But they settle into my chest like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples through everything I thought I understood about this moment, this place, this man who once made my life a careful kind of hell, and who now sits beside my deathbed, reading stories I'll never remember. The morning after that conversation about hate and staying, I find myself thinking about the life I had before this room became my world. It's strange how illness has a way of making your past feel both impossibly distant and achingly present, as if you're looking at it through the wrong end of a telescope. Everything's smaller than it was, but somehow clearer too. I was Silas Monroe, and for nearly 2 decades after college, I had built something that worked. Not spectacular, not the kind of life that makes for interesting stories at dinner parties, but solid, reliable. Mine. I taught music at Roosevelt Middle School, spending my days trying to convince 13-year-olds that the recorder was not, in fact, an instrument of torture, and that Beethoven had something to say to them across the centuries. Most of them didn't listen, but a few did, and those few made the whole endeavor feel worthwhile. My apartment on Maple Street was small, but filled with the things that mattered to me. Guitars lined one wall, a vintage Martin that had cost me 3 months' salary, a beat-up Yamaha that had seen me through college and still held its tuning better than instruments twice its price, an electric Fender that I rarely played but couldn't bring myself to sell because it had belonged to my father. Records covered every available surface, vinyl and CD alike, a catalog of every song that had ever mattered to me. Jazz and classical, folk and indie rock, the kind of eclectic collection that made visiting students roll their eyes and older teachers nod in recognition of a fellow music obsessive. There was David, too. David Chun, who taught literature at the high school across town and who shared my love of quiet Sunday mornings and complicated coffee drinks. We had been together for 8 years when the diagnosis came, 8 years of the kind of steady, unexamined happiness that you don't realize is precious until it starts slipping away. David was good with words in the way that English teachers are, always able to find the right thing to say when students were struggling or when I came home frustrated by budget cuts and administrative incompetence. But when the doctors started using phrases like aggressive treatment and prognosis uncertain, David's words began to fail him. Not all at once. He stayed through the first round of chemotherapy, held my hand during the worst of the nausea, rearranged his teaching schedule to drive me to appointments. But I could see something changing in his eyes, a kind of retreat that started small and grew larger with each test result, each conversation with oncologists who spoke in percentages and possibilities rather than certainties. The day moved out, 6 weeks after my first hospitalization. He cried. We both did. He packed his books and his clothes and half of our shared music collection, and he told me he loved me, but that he couldn't watch me die. Not like this. Not slowly. It wasn't cruel. Exactly. David had never been cruel, but it was honest in a way that cut deeper than cruelty would have. He kissed my forehead before he left, the kind of kiss you give to someone you're saying goodbye to forever, and then he was gone. Most of our friends followed a similar pattern, though with less honesty about their reasons. They visited at first, bringing flowers and books and awkward conversations about everything except the obvious. But illness has a way of making people uncomfortable with their own mortality, and gradually the visits became phone calls, then text messages, then careful silence. I don't blame them for it. Not really. Death is frightening, and dying people make poor companions for those who still believe in their own invincibility. I had grown accustomed to the solitude, had even found a kind of peace in it. The hospital room became my world, bounded by machines that hummed their mechanical lullabies and nurses who spoke in gentle voices about pain management and comfort measures. I learned the rhythms of this place, shift changes at 7 and 7, meal times that bore no resemblance to actual meals, visiting hours that few people bothered to observe. It was a small life, but it was mine, and I had made my peace with the fact that I would navigate it alone, which is why Victor Clay's appearance felt like a violation of the natural order, an intrusion into a space where he had no business being. When he walked into my room 3 months after David left, carrying a bag of Chinese takeout and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read, my first instinct was to assume he was lost. Hospitals are confusing places, full of identical corridors and numbered rooms that blend together in the minds of visitors who don't belong there. Instead, he set the bag on the table beside my bed and said, "You don't have to like me. I'm still staying." His voice carried the same authority it had possessed in college, but the cruelty was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like determination. He unpacked containers of lo mein and sweet and sour chicken, the kind of cheap Chinese food that tastes like childhood and comfort in equal measure. And he didn't ask if I was hungry or if I wanted company or if I understood why he was there. He simply stayed. That was 4 weeks ago, and nothing about it has made sense since. Victor Clay, who once made my senior year a systematic exercise in humiliation, who treated my existence like a personal affront, who turned my final months of college into a careful navigation around his unpredictable cruelty, was now the only person left who refused to treat me like I was already gone. The irony was so complete it felt almost biblical in its scope. The first time I tried to send Victor away, it was a Tuesday morning when the pain medication wasn't working and every breath felt like swallowing glass. He had arrived, as he always did, with coffee that was too strong and a newspaper folded to the crossword puzzle, settling into that chair as if he had been assigned to it by some cosmic decree. The familiarity of his presence irritated me more than usual that day. The way his quiet competence made my own helplessness feel sharper, more defined. I don't need charity, I told him, my voice hoarse from a night of restless sleep. Whatever this is, guilt, pity, some misguided attempt at redemption, I don't want it. You can go home now. You can go back to your life and pretend we never knew each other. It would be easier for both of us. Victor looked up from the crossword, his pen hovering over a half-completed word. He studied my face for a long moment, taking in the flush of fever and frustration, the way my hand shook slightly as I reached for the water cup. Then he went back to the puzzle, his pen moving across the squares with deliberate precision. 7 letters, he said, as if I hadn't spoken at all. Stubborn to a fault. That was the beginning of what became a pattern. I would ask him to leave, sometimes politely, sometimes with the kind of anger that surprised both of us with its intensity. He would respond by doing something practical, adjusting my pillows, calling the nurse for more blankets, arguing with the insurance company about coverage for procedures I couldn't pronounce. His refusal to engage with my dismissals was maddening and, in a way I couldn't quite articulate, deeply comforting. The second time I tried to send him away was after a particularly difficult session with the oncologist, one of those conversations where words like palliative and comfort care hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. The doctor had been kind but direct, explaining that the aggressive treatments weren't working, that we needed to start thinking about quality of life rather than quantity. Victor had been there for all of it, taking notes in his careful handwriting, asking questions I was too overwhelmed to formulate. After the doctor left, I turned to him with what little energy I had left. "This isn't your responsibility," I said. "You don't owe me anything. We barely knew each other in college, and what we did know wasn't good. You have your own life, your own problems. You don't need to waste your time watching me die." Victor was quiet for so long that I thought maybe he had finally heard me, finally understood that his presence here was as confusing as it was unwelcome. But when he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. "I'm not wasting anything," he said, "and I'm not going anywhere." The third time was different. It was late at night, during one of those sleepless hours when the hospital felt like a ship adrift in dark water, and the pain had reached a level that made thinking difficult and breathing an act of conscious will. Victor had been dozing in his chair, his head tilted at that impossible angle that would leave him sore for days, when I woke from a restless half-sleep to find him watching me with an expression I couldn't read. "Why are you here?" I asked, the question finally breaking free from the place where I had kept it buried for weeks. The morphine made my voice sound distant, even to my own ears, but the words carried the weight of everything I couldn't understand about this situation. "Why are you doing this?" Victor was quiet for a long time, long enough for me to wonder if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I was a coward before." The words hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. There was weight in them, a gravity that suggested depths I hadn't imagined, connections I hadn't considered. But before I could ask what he meant, exhaustion pulled me back under, and when I woke again hours later, he was reading to me from that book I didn't like, his voice steady and sure in the gray morning light. It was around this time that the flashbacks began, or maybe they had always been there, and I was only now allowing myself to acknowledge them. Fragments of memory from our senior year would surface at unexpected moments. Victor's face across a crowded classroom, his expression unreadable. The way he would go silent when I entered a room, as if my presence had broken something essential in the air around him. The particular quality of his anger, which always seemed directed at something larger than whatever immediate offense I had supposedly committed. I began to remember things I had forgotten or chosen not to examine too closely. The way his cruelty always seemed performed rather than felt, as if he were reading from a script he didn't entirely believe in. The fact that his worst attacks on me always happened when other people were watching, as if he needed an audience to make them real. The strange, charged moments when we were alone together, rare as they were, when something else would flicker across his features before the mask of contempt slid back into place. One memory in particular kept returning to me, sharp and vivid despite the years that had passed. It was late in the semester, and I had been working alone in the music practice room, trying to finish a composition that was due the next day. The piece was giving me trouble, It was meant to be hopeful, triumphant, but everything I wrote sounded hollow and forced. I was so absorbed in the work that I didn't hear the door open, didn't realize anyone had entered until I looked up to find Victor standing there, listening. For a moment, neither of us moved or spoke. The unfinished melody hung in the air between us, vulnerable and incomplete. Victor's face was unguarded in a way I had never seen before, his usual mask of derision replaced by something that looked almost like longing. But then awareness crept back into his features, and the moment shattered like glass hitting concrete. "Your music is pathetic," he had said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Nobody wants to hear your sad little songs." Now, 20 years later, lying in this hospital bed with machines marking time until my heart stops, I found myself wondering what might have happened if I had been brave enough to ask him why he had really come to that practice room that night, what he had been looking for in the space between my notes and his silence. The shift between us happens gradually, like the way dawn creeps across a room so slowly that you don't notice the darkness leaving until it's already gone. One day, I wake to find that Victor has learned the names not just of my nurses, but of their children, their weekend plans, their complaints about hospital administration. He jokes with Maria about her son's Little League games and listens patiently while Janet explains the complications of her divorce proceedings. They treat him like family now, these women who have seen enough visitors come and go to recognize the difference between obligation and genuine care. He helps me shower on the days when standing feels like an insurmountable challenge, his hands steady and clinical as he guides me through the motions that healthy people take for granted. There's nothing romantic about it. Illness has a way of stripping away pretense and leaving only the essential mechanics of survival. But there's a tenderness in his efficiency that catches me off guard. He doesn't avert his eyes from my diminished body, doesn't flinch at the surgical scars or the port where they attach the 4 lines. He simply does what needs to be done, the same way he might help a child tie their shoes or an elderly parent navigate a flight of stairs. We talk more now, filling the spaces between medical procedures and meal times with conversations that feel both familiar and strange. He tells me about his marriage to Sarah, a kindergarten teacher who loved gardening and mystery novels and who left him 3 years ago when she realized that his emotional unavailability wasn't a phase, but a fundamental part of who he was. No children, he says, though they tried for a while. Maybe that was for the best, considering how things turned out. I tell him about David, though the telling feels like excavating something that's been buried too long, turning over memories that have already started to decompose. David was good to me, I say, and Victor nods as if he understands the weight of past tense, the way it transforms even happy memories into something that feels like loss. We don't say much about the fact that David left and Victor stayed, but the contrast sits between us like a fact too large to ignore. There are practical things, too, mundane details that somehow feel more intimate than the larger conversations. Victor argues with my insurance company about coverage for procedures I can't pronounce, his voice rising to that dangerous pitch I remember from college, except now it's directed at bureaucrats who treat human suffering like a line item in a budget report. He brings me books I would never choose, thrillers and science fiction, genres I've always dismissed as beneath my literary tastes, and reads them aloud with the same careful attention he once brought to academic papers. He sleeps in that chair more nights than he goes home, his tall frame folded into angles that look profoundly uncomfortable but which he never complains about. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night to find him watching me, making sure I'm still breathing, ready to call for help if something goes wrong. Other times he's asleep himself, his face relaxed in a way that makes him look younger, closer to the boy I remember from college before everything went wrong between us. It's during one of those sleepless nights when the pain has reached a level that makes everything else seem distant and unreal that something fundamental shifts between us. The medication isn't working, hasn't been working for hours, and each breath feels like an act of rebellion against a body that has decided it's tired of cooperating. I try to be quiet about it, to suffer with the kind of dignity that people expect from the dying, but the pain overwhelms my attempts at stoicism. Victor notices immediately the way he always does. He calls for the nurse, adjusts my pillows, does all the practical things that might help. But when none of it works, when the pain continues to build like a wave that refuses to break, he does something unexpected. He sits on the edge of the bed and reaches for my hand, not with the clinical efficiency of someone providing medical assistance, but with the tentative care of someone offering comfort. Without thinking, without weighing the implications or considering the history that lies between us, I lean into his shoulder. It's an instinctive movement, the way a child reaches for a parent in the dark. And for a moment, I expect him to pull away, to retreat back into the careful distance he's maintained despite weeks of constant presence. Instead, he goes very still. Doesn't move, doesn't breathe, doesn't shift away from the weight of my body against his. He simply lets me rest there, my cheek against the soft cotton of his shirt, my breathing gradually sinking with the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. We stay like that for what feels like hours, though it might have been minutes. Time moves differently when you're dying, expanding, and contracting in ways that defy normal measurement. Later, after the stronger medication has finally kicked in and the pain has receded to manageable levels, Victor speaks into the quiet darkness of the room. His voice is barely above a whisper, as if he's afraid that speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile thing has formed between us. "I didn't hate you," he says, the words falling into the space between us like stones dropped into still water. "I hated me." The confession hangs there, honest and raw, in a way that makes my chest tight with something that isn't physical pain. I want to ask him what he means, want to excavate the full weight of those words and understand the history they carry. But exhaustion is pulling at me, the medication making my thoughts slow and heavy, and before I can form the questions that need asking, sleep takes me under. When I wake hours later, Victor is still there, still holding my hand, and I realize that something has changed between us that can't be unchanged. The air feels different now, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure, as if we've finally acknowledged the presence of something that has been waiting in the shadows for 20 years. The storm arrives 3 days after Victor's whispered confession, bringing with it the kind of rain that turns windows into rivers and makes the whole world feel underwater. Thunder rolls across the city in waves, each crash seeming to shake the foundations of the hospital, and the lights flicker with an uncertainty that mirrors my own heartbeat. It's the kind of weather that makes even healthy people feel restless and unmoored, and for someone like me, tethered to machines and medication schedules, it feels apocalyptic. I wake sometime after midnight to find Victor asleep in his chair, but something is different about the scene. His hand is resting on the edge of my bed, palm up, and my own hand has found its way there. During sleep, our fingers intertwined in a way that feels both completely natural and utterly impossible. I watch him for a long time, studying the way sleep has erased the careful guardedness from his features, the way his breathing has synced with the rhythm of the rain against the window. His face is older now, marked by years I wasn't present for, but underneath the lines and silver hair, I can still see traces of the boy he was in college. The sharp line of his jaw, the way his eyebrows draw together, even in sleep, the particular curve of his mouth that I remember watching across crowded lecture halls while pretending to take notes on subjects that suddenly seemed less important than the mystery of what he might be thinking. In the dim light filtering through the rain-streaked window, with his defenses down and his hand warm in mine, Victor Clay looks almost vulnerable. It's a word I never would have associated with him 20 years ago, when he seemed to move through the world with the kind of casual cruelty that belongs to people who are certain of their place in it. But lying here in this hospital bed, holding the hand of a man who once made my life a careful kind of hell, vulnerability seems like the only word that fits. Why didn't you tell me back then? The question emerges from some deep part of me before I can stop it, spoken into the storm-dark room like a prayer or a challenge. I don't expect him to hear me. The words are barely above a whisper, lost in the sound of rain and distant thunder. But Victor's eyes open immediately, as if he's been waiting for this moment, this question, for 20 years. He doesn't pull his hand away from mine, doesn't retreat into the careful distance that has defined most of our interactions since he started coming here. Instead, he meets my gaze directly, And in his eyes, I see something I've never seen before, complete, unflinching honesty. Because you were brave enough to be who you were, he says, his voice steady despite the tears that have started falling down his cheeks. And I wasn't. So I made you pay for it. The words land in my chest like physical things, heavy and sharp and impossible to ignore. 20 years of confusion suddenly rearranged themselves into a pattern I can finally recognize. Puzzle pieces clicking into place with an almost audible sound. The cruelty that always seemed performed rather than felt. The way his worst attacks happened when other people were watching. The strange, charged moments when we were alone and something else would flicker across his features before the mask slid back into place. You were out. He continues, the words coming faster now, as if a dam has broken somewhere inside him. You were 17 years old, and you knew who you were, and you didn't apologize for it. You walked through that campus like you belonged there, like you had every right to take up space and be seen and be yourself. And I was terrified that if I spent too much time around you, if I let myself want what I wanted, everyone would know. The tears are flowing freely now, 20 years worth of them, and I find myself reaching up to touch his face with my free hand. The gesture feels impossible, too intimate for what we are to each other, but somehow also the only response that makes sense. His skin is warm under my palm, real and solid in a way that grounds me in this moment, this conversation that feels like it's happening outside of normal time. So you made me the enemy, I say, and it's not quite a question. You decided it was safer to hate me than to examine what you really felt. Victor nods, leaning into my touch in a way that makes my chest tight with something that isn't physical pain. I was 18 and stupid and scared, he says. I thought if I could make you small enough, invisible enough, maybe what I felt when I looked at you would go away too. I thought if I hurt you enough, I could stop wanting to be like you. The admission hangs between us like a bridge finally built across 20 years of silence. I think about the boy I was then, walking through that campus with what Victor saw as courage, but what felt to me like simple survival. I had been out because hiding seemed more exhausting than honesty, because pretending to be someone else felt like a kind of death I wasn't ready for. But I had never considered what my visibility might have meant to someone else, someone who was drowning in the same waters but hadn't yet learned how to swim. I wish you had told me, I say, though even as the words leave my mouth, I know how naive they sound. How could he have told me, when telling would have required admitting things to himself that he wasn't ready to face? How could either of us have navigated that conversation when we barely had the vocabulary for our own desires, let alone the courage to share them with someone else? Victor's hand tightens around mine, and I realize that we're both crying now, tears for the boys we were and the time we lost, and the simple, devastating fact that it took me dying for us to finally tell each other the truth. I'm sorry, he whispers, and the words carry the weight of everything we've never said to each other, everything we've spent 20 years avoiding. I'm so fucking sorry, Silas. I know. I tell him and I do. I know, and I forgive you, and I wish we had done this years ago when we still had time to build something better than regret. The meeting with Dr. Reyes happens on a Tuesday morning when the light coming through the window is the pale, apologetic kind that suggests winter is thinking about arriving early. Victor is there, as he always is now, sitting close enough to my bed that our knees are almost touching, his notebook open on his lap with questions written in his careful handwriting. He has become my advocate in ways I never asked for, but find myself grateful for. The person who remembers to ask about side effects and drug interactions when my own brain feels too foggy to form coherent thoughts. Dr. Reyes is kind, but direct, the way good doctors learn to be when they've had to deliver news like this more times than they care to count. She explains that the latest scans show progression, that the aggressive treatments we've been trying aren't working the way we hoped they would. The cancer has spread to places it wasn't before, taken up residence in parts of my body that I had foolishly believed might remain untouched. The words she uses are clinical but not unkind. Palliative care, comfort measures, quality of life rather than quantity. I find myself nodding as she speaks, though I'm not sure if it's because I understand or because nodding feels like the appropriate response to information this enormous. Victor asks questions that I should be asking, takes notes about things I should be writing down, advocates for me with a fierce protectiveness that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. When Dr. Reyes leaves, promising to return later with more information about comfort care options, the silence that follows feels both heavy and strangely peaceful. Victor sets his notebook aside and looks at me with an expression I can't quite read. "Are you okay?" he asks, which might be the most ridiculous question anyone has ever posed to a dying man, but somehow I understand what he means. He's asking if I'm okay with the choice we need to make, if I'm ready to stop fighting a war that was never winnable and start focusing on how I want to spend whatever time is left. I think so, I tell him, and I'm surprised to realize that it's true. The aggressive treatments have been brutal, leaving me nauseous and weak and feeling like a stranger in my own body. The idea of stopping them, of choosing comfort over the increasingly distant possibility of cure, feels less like giving up and more like coming home to myself. "I want you to stay," I say, the words emerging before I've fully formed the thought. Not out of obligation or guilt or whatever brought you here in the first place. I want you to stay because I want you here, for whatever time there is left. The distinction feels important, though I'm not sure I can articulate why. For weeks now, Victor's presence has been a mystery I couldn't solve, a kindness I couldn't understand or fully accept. But something has shifted since that stormy night when we finally told each other the truth about what happened 20 years ago. The air between us feels different now, charged with possibility rather than confusion, heavy with things we're finally brave enough to say. Victor is quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on his hands where they rest on the edge of my bed. When he speaks, his voice is careful, as if he's testing each word before allowing it into the space between us. "I loved you back then," he says, and the admission falls into the room like a stone dropped into still water. I just didn't know how. I didn't have the words for it, didn't have the courage to even acknowledge it to myself. All I knew was that looking at you made me feel things I've been taught were wrong, dangerous, something to be buried so deep that even I couldn't find them. The confession doesn't surprise me the way it might have weeks ago. Since that night, when he told me about hating himself instead of me, I've been putting together the pieces of a story that makes sense in ways our original narrative never did. A boy terrified of his own desires, lashing out at the person who represented everything he wanted to be but couldn't allow himself to become. It's a common enough story, though that doesn't make it any less tragic for its familiarity. And now, I ask, though I think I already know the answer. It's written in the way he's refused to leave despite my attempts to send him away, in the tenderness with which he helps me through the daily indignities of illness, in the way he holds my hand during the worst of the pain, as if his presence alone might be enough to keep me tethered to the world. "Still do," he says simply, and there's no drama in it, no declaration or grand gesture. Just a fact stated as plainly as the color of the sky or the day of the week. He loves me, has loved me for 20 years, through college and marriage and divorce, and all the ordinary disasters that make up a human life. The knowledge settles into my chest like something I've been waiting for without knowing it, a missing piece that makes the whole picture finally make sense. I reach for his hand, intertwining our fingers in a gesture that feels both new and ancient, as if we've been doing this for decades instead of weeks. "I don't have long," I tell him, and we both know it's true. The doctors don't need to give us timelines for us to understand that we're talking about weeks rather than months, days rather than years. But I'm glad you're here for it. I'm glad we get to have this, even if it's not what either of us planned. Victor brings my hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to my palm that feels like a promise and a goodbye all at once. "Whatever time there is," he says, and I know he means it. "Whatever time there is, we'll spend it together, finally honest about what we mean to each other, finally brave enough to be seen." Outside the window, the pale morning light is growing stronger, and I think about how strange it is that the most important conversation of my life is happening in a hospital room while machines monitor the slow failure of my body. But maybe that's appropriate. Maybe it takes the prospect of ending for some stories to finally begin. The end, when it comes, is quieter than I expected. There are no dramatic declarations or final revelations, no sudden clarity about the meaning of life or the nature of existence. There's only the steady rhythm of Victor's breathing beside me, the weight of his hand in mine, and the gradual loosening of everything that has held me to this world for 40 years. It happens on a Thursday afternoon when the light outside is golden and slanted in the way that suggests autumn is finally ready to give way to winter. The pain medication has reached levels that make everything feel distant and dreamlike, as if I'm watching my own life through thick glass. Victor is reading to me from a book I still don't like, his voice steady and sure despite the fact that we both know I'm not really listening anymore. The words wash over me like water, meaningless but comforting in their familiar cadence. I drift in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of conversations between Victor and the nurses, glimpses of his face when he thinks I'm not watching, the particular way he adjusts my pillows when he believes I can no longer feel the difference. There's something beautiful about his persistence, the way he continues to care for me, even as my ability to respond diminishes day by day. It's love stripped down to its most essential elements: presence, attention, the simple act of bearing witness to another person's journey toward the end. My mother comes to visit, flying in from Phoenix with her worried eyes and her need to say things that should have been said years ago. She sits on the other side of my bed, holding my other hand while Victor retreats to give us space, and she tells me about how proud she is of the man I became, how sorry she is that it took this long for her to say it out loud. The words feel good to hear, even filtered through the haze of medication, but they can't compete with the steady comfort of Victor's presence. David comes too, eventually. He stands in the doorway, looking older than his years, his face tight with the particular kind of pain that comes from loving someone you couldn't save. Victor doesn't leave during his visit. I wouldn't let him, even if I had the energy to speak, but he moves to the window, pretending to be absorbed in the view of the parking lot while David and I have our careful, necessary goodbye. There are apologies and forgiveness, and the acknowledgement that love sometimes isn't enough to overcome fear, but that doesn't make it less real or less important. After David leaves, Victor returns to his chair beside my bed, and we don't talk about the visit or what it meant or how it felt to see the man who once shared my life struggle with the reality of my approaching death. Instead, he picks up the book and continues reading from where he left off, his voice at anchor in the increasingly uncertain waters of my consciousness. The days blur together after that. Victor sleeps in the chair every night now, his long frame folded into impossible angles, waking at the slightest change in my breathing or the softest sound of distress. The nurses have stopped trying to convince him to go home, recognizing something in his vigilance that transcends normal visiting hours or hospital protocols. He has become part of the landscape of my dying, as essential as the machines that monitor my vital signs or the medications that keep the pain at bay. On what turns out to be my last morning, I wake to find him sitting closer than usual, our faces only inches apart. His eyes are red-rimmed with exhaustion and something deeper, but his hand in mine is steady and warm. I try to speak, to tell him something important about gratitude or love, or the strange gift of having someone stay, when staying becomes the hardest thing imaginable, but the words won't come. Instead, I squeeze his hand as tightly as my failing strength allows, hoping he can read in that pressure everything I can no longer say aloud. He understands. He always has, I realize now, even 20 years ago when understanding felt too dangerous to acknowledge. You don't have to say anything, he whispers, his voice rough with unshed tears. I know, and I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. The afternoon light fades gradually, taking with it the last of my strength and the final threads that connect me to consciousness. But Victor's hand remains in mine, steady and sure and exactly where it belongs. And his voice continues to read words I can no longer process, but that somehow still provide comfort. He reads until my breathing grows shallow and irregular, until the spaces between heartbeats stretch longer and longer, until the machines begin to sound alarms that bring nurses running with their professional urgency and their kind, knowing faces. But even then, even as the room fills with activity and medical terminology, and the particular chaos that surrounds death in hospitals, Victor doesn't let go. His hand stays wrapped around mine until the very last breath leaves my body, until the monitors flatline and the nurses gently suggest that it's time, until there's nothing left but the weight of absence and the memory of 20 years finally made right. At my funeral, which is small and simple in the way I would have wanted, Victor stands apart from the other mourners. He doesn't speak during the service or approach the casket during the viewing, but just before the ceremony ends, he walks forward and places something on the polished wood, a folded piece of sheet music, yellowed with age and worn from handling. It's the composition I wrote in college, the one he found me working on that night in the practice room, the one he called pathetic before I ever had the chance to finish it. Later, alone in my apartment that he's been keeping exactly as I left it, Victor sits at my old guitar and plays that piece from memory, his fingers finding the melody I never completed, adding harmonies I never imagined. The music fills the small space where I once lived, where I kept my records and my books, and all the ordinary treasures of life lived quietly but fully. And for the first time since I died, Victor allows himself to cry without reservation, his tears falling like rain on the strings of a guitar that finally knows what it sounds like to be played with love.